Hi, welcome back to my channel. I always say that my channel is not a narcissist recovery channel in exclusion to everything else, but whenever I do find out an interesting facet of narcissistic abuse recovery or toxic people recovery, I do like to share it on my channel because I do think it's helpful for me, and it may well be to other people that have experienced the same thing or kind of relate. So I want to talk about. Basically, I watched, and I got this idea off a different video, which I learned this information from, but I'm going to reiterate it in a way because it's also therapeutic for me to obviously talk it through and obviously share it with someone else, for someone else get the information that they might not have seen on someone else's video and put my own spin on it. But it's the idea that narcissists are trapped inside this mental cage within their ego. So I don't know who's completely new to narcissism, but the idea of narcissism is based around this concept. I'm not going to go through every facet of narcissism now because it's quite a complicated subject, but the sense of how narcissists are driven from this false sense of self. They believe we have our brains, they have this false sense of self, their ego, that is a grandiose, extremely insecure. It's a coping strategy, narcissism, to deal with an insecure personality that is really afraid of fear and rejection, fears rejection and stuff because they feel inadequate. And then everything that they do is to protect their ego and that delicate sense of self, that fragile sense of self that they create, which is not honest to themselves. Their selves are very negative because everything is driven around protecting their fragile ego, and they'll abuse people in order to compensate for that and feel like they're superior because they know how inadequate they are within themselves or how they feel, and then they'll basically try and make you feel even worse than them so they feel like they've won. And that's basically the whole video in a nutshell. But he talks about different facets of this idea, and it's the idea of them being in a cage and wanting you to be in their cage, but also just be in a tighter cage than them, as I said, so they feel safe and better, or they feel like they're suffering less. Their burden is easier to bear if they feel like you're in their cage with them or you're in a worse cage and they've won or something, because they're dark-minded often, narcissists. It's not so. Anyway, the idea of being in a cage is that there's a fixed agenda, you don't have the freedom to move around, and they can't, as I said, it's a projection of the way they cope, and they can't come to terms with narcissism within themselves. That's the whole point of narcissists. They're unable to self-reflect, honestly. They might come across and say that they're going to self-reflect or go to therapy or whatever. It's usually it's usually a lie, or whether they go or not, it's to drag you back into their manipulation. They psychologically have not got the ability to self-reflect, unless they're a self-aware narcissist, which most narcissists aren't. Some people are self-aware narcissists and they can identify their patterns, but the whole point of narcissism is that they don't want to come to terms and look at the negative aspects of themselves, so they have to overcompensate through their actions in order to make up for that in their mind, because they're unable to identify that in themselves and honestly come to terms with how they are. And it's a defense mechanism of projection. I've done a whole video on defense mechanisms that everyone has, so I'm not going to talk about that now, but it's basically projection, which is where you put your feelings onto another person in order to not have to cope with it yourself, and that's what this cage is about generally. So the first thing that they do, so they go about this in a lot of ways, such as isolation, anger, fear, shame, doubt, and conformity. And they try and use all these tactics that they struggle with themselves and use this on another person. For example, with the isolation factor, they want you to feel at odds with what's normal in the world and that you have no respect from others. They try and break down you generally, so you have a really poor sense of self and blame you for your relationship that's toxic with them. So even though they're a toxic person, they're unable to have a healthy relationship or a functional relationship, they'll then put the blame on you for that, it's your fault to have to deal with or something. So yeah, it's a projection because they are, so notice the projection, which is that they are rejected from a very young age, or any time they come down from the planet onto the planet, I assume, to be able to feel at odds with, they sense very quickly that they're unable, because from an energetic level, do you know what I mean? Like narcissists, the whole point of the coping strategy of narcissism is that they can protect themselves, and they wouldn't need to protect themselves if they didn't have like an inadequate sense of self. And that's kind of the whole point. But it's like they feel then rejected from the world, and that they don't have respect from a lot of people, and like they blame themselves probably on some level, because they do understand these things. It's just it's not on a conscious level. Like on some level they know that they are the problem, it's just they won't admit it to themselves, and most things they do is to sidestep that fact. So they feel excluded and entrapped by this, and so they break others down. So they'll feel superior. They think, if you're isolated and you feel inadequate, then I feel better about myself. That is just the way that they try and work it out within their mind, as like a compensation. We all compensate for different things, you know what I mean? I've said a couple of times, people compensate through overachievement, social status, or people pleasing, and unfortunately it doesn't really matter which way you compensate, these things still apply. So when they're angry, because narcissists live on this constant resonation of anger and agitation, just because like various reasons they feel rejected by other people, and like I've mentioned in the past covert narcissists as well, they'll often like, because like lying is a massive part of narcissism, but because they're like, they don't really have much, constructive, like insightful things to say, shall I say, because they have this lack of insight and like shallow depth of emotion, that they kind of lie about like what they're into and what they are interested in and what their hobbies are and stuff, maybe, or just like they make stuff up to like make themselves sound interesting, because they are quite like boring sometimes, because they don't have that sort of, zest for like certain things. Maybe, I don't know, it's not about zest, but it's like because they feel inadequate and they don't have that insight, they'll have to lie, and it must be like quite disheartening to have to like lie about all of the interesting things that you are perceived to have, and build your ego up to each individual person, even though people are also very insightful. You've got to think, people that aren't narcissists, especially empaths, are renowned for knowing what narcissists are like. Even without, much time, they can kind of pick them out quite easily. If needed, they can just kind of identify them, shall I say. It's not for anyone really to control another person or handle them in whatever way, but empaths are, narcissists will love to, safe port you into that idea that you're responsible for them in some delusional aspect, but you're not, and it's not for you to manage another person, of course, but at the same time, this brings this level of anger for various reasons. They're jealous of other people. They know they can't work on the standard of, people that are healthy or, valued and have friendship that's genuine. And they sort of resonate on that, obviously. Can't be easy, to be fair. Not that you should pity them, they're toxic people, and it's who they are, and it's who they will always be, and it's, we're all dealt our cards in life, we all have our issues, but it's not for you to feel sorry for them. But it's a case of they live on this anger, so they kind of will try and evoke anger from you, so they can, if and when you do react, because you're a human being, I mentioned this in my last video, when and if you do react, which is human and normal, if provoked or, accused or antagonized in a certain way, they can then, maximize that either in front of others or just to themselves and say, hey, look, I knew you were angry, and it gives them a bit of relief in a weird way. They say that about sociopaths. They love it when you get riled up, because it gives them a sense of temporary relief, because they can kind of mentalize that you are the problem and they are not, even though they are intrinsically the issue. They can temporarily convince themselves that you are the issue and give them some form of mental relief from the, intrinsic anger that they have, and be like, oh, I'm so angry because there's people like you reacting to me all the time and making me, annoyed or whatever. Like, that's the kind of mindset they'll bring into themselves, and they'll kind of justify, their anger because you're reacting to them being an asshole. So it doesn't really make much logical sense, and it's kind of weak. And I kind of talk about narcissism in that just because they're abusive doesn't mean they're strong people. If anything, they're much weaker than, you know, healthy people, because they haven't really got a leg to stand on. A lot of it's just fabricated. Most of it's fabricated within their ego, like all of it. Like they might take snippets of the truth, like if they have blonde hair, they might be like, oh, I don't know, like, I don't know what blonde hair's got to do with it, but it's like, you know, they can work off all sorts of things. So anyway, the next cage or projection idea that they will work from, I want to keep staying with this cage idea of they're stuck in this cage of like, so for the last one, they're stuck in this cage of fear, as I said, this sort of like prolonged fear. They're also stuck in this cage of, the last one was anger. They're also stuck in this like inevitable fear cage and intimidation from other people that are healthy, because that threatens their sense of ego, especially if someone is to like literally point out their flaws. Because of narcissists, I'm going to get onto flaws in a minute with shame, but when people would, you know, they're consistently on edge to you know, they fear rejection, they fear being dominated by others. So they think, oh, if I can put fear into you and dominate you, I'm less vulnerable at that point, because you know, it makes it's more fear based. So they can then look at you, if you then become, you know, sort of a bit more meek or like defensive even, they can be like, oh, what, like that's kind of the preface of like, you know, sociopathic bullying, when they're like, oh, look what a loser you are, when they're really sidestepping their own vulnerability. I think that's a bit of a stereotype of bullies that comes up, just as a general thing. I think they always say like bullies are like so, you know, insecure and vulnerable within their own sense of mind, so they have to put that on another person to displace that, and that's exactly what I'm talking about here in this cage of like fear and intimidation. So yeah, that's just a projection, because we all do have this coping mechanism to project. Like, you know, it's even to the case of like a healthy person, a projection. I mean, we can all project negatively, you know, we can all project positively. Like I've been known to, as I said, I don't think you have to be kind to a toxic person. You know, like if you know, I'll be narcissistic and toxic. We all have the capacity to be toxic, and being around toxic people makes you toxic. But it's a case of like, if, like, you know, you can be toxic. Like, it's not the goal to be toxic. It's being toxic, it just means you're sinking to their level. But excuse me. But you can actually, you know, say to a narcissist like, you can put that intimidation into them just because you've potentially been intimidated by them in the past or whatever. Like, you know, you can feel intimidated and overcompensate for that intimidation by puffing yourself up, because we all have the capacity to have human coping mechanisms and overcompensate. But it's just the fact of narcissists have this on this really, you know, not maladaptive, but dysfunctional level, and that's what these cages are about. Because no one wants to be in this constant state of fear, and no one wants to be in a constant state of shame or doubt or anger or whatever. It's a conversation they have to have. And the anger, I suppose, also might come from frustration, I have to just say, of like needing to suppress their instincts all the time. That will probably agitate them, I can imagine. So the next one is shame. Narcissists have this consistent self-loathing of their flaws. They can't be vulnerable with themselves. They can't be vulnerable with others. I've done a video on this in the past about intimacy, about narcissists and intimacy. So I kind of do get this more already, where they can't be vulnerable because they don't have the capacity or level, because to them, showing like their flaws they are aware of on some level, whether they won't admit it to themselves if they're not self-aware, but they know that their flaws, they think from a very, 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 you know, young age in development, they think, if I show my flaws, because they can't protect themselves, and that's where the vulnerability comes from, their flaws are seen as, I will be dominated, I will be feared if I show any vulnerability to anyone. So they project all that onto you, and they love it when they can make you feel like you have a lot of flaws, or like they love it when the flaws they pick out in you, or they might harden you up, and feel like you can't show your vulnerability, even though vulnerability is just a natural part of life. I don't think, I did mention in this video, I think it's important not to show your vulnerability to people that don't deserve it or are going to take advantage of it, because people do take advantage of vulnerabilities. But it's a case of like, if they, so them making you harden up to them, I don't think is the worst thing, but it's a case of like, they do love it when, if they point out your flaws to them, if they point out your flaws to you, that you then integrate that into your own personality, like it's like some form of like, achievement that they've had, that they've kind of made you acknowledge shame in yourself. Obviously, I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging vulnerability and shame in yourself. I think it's actually a very, very healthy sign of a healthy ego, but it's a case of like, they can't be vulnerable. So if they make you feel like you can't be vulnerable, or you hate your own flaws, they love it when you take on their shame by either acknowledging shame in yourself that isn't necessarily necessary to pick out. For example, your hair is a bit funny today. Do you know what I mean? It's not something to ruminate on or get really stressed over. It's just what it is. Like, who cares? But then a narcissist might pick out that sort of idea to like evoke shame, so they can displace their own shame onto you for something that's not even shameful in the first place. But their behaviour is shameful because they're doing all this stuff that's extremely shameful. You should feel ashamed for doing that, but it's a case of like they'll project that onto others. So the next thing is doubt, avoiding coming to terms with themselves. Yeah, so they'll have this level of doubt because, to be honest with you, their whole ego is based on something doubtful. Like, it's not true at the end of the day, it's lies. So they do have this like humane level of doubt that is like, should I come to terms, like, obviously they know that they're lying to themselves, even, they do, and narcissists are renowned, depending on what kind of narcissist. I talked about in my last video how some narcissists are just completely delusional, to the point where they will actually convince themselves of like the fact that they're literally like the best person ever, or like they're like the centre of another person's life, when that's just not the case at all. Or like they'll just be like, everyone's looking at me, if they're a paranoid narcissist or whatever, and like everyone's just like really interested in what I'm doing and blah blah. And it's just a case of like they have this like intrinsic doubt of like, am I even being truthful? Like, because we all kind of seek truth out because we're all human beings, but they can't identify those types of rationalizations in their own mind if they're narcissists, unless they're self-aware narcissists. But even then, I think obviously the pattern still fares, they're still narcissists. I need to delete a video so I don't run out. So yeah, they'll have this sort of like intrinsic level of doubt that comes into their mind when they're doubting their own selves, which is what I was saying. And they project this again, and they're very insecure narcissists, for this reason. Obviously their sense of self is false, so they'll be like, they're always like, how do I look okay, am I doing the right thing? And then they like you to doubt yourself, because so by this they also gaslight you, which is when they make you doubt your sense of reality, and this sort of like really helps them to justify their own doubt, because they feel like they've won, because they've dominated your sense of doubt, that they then can justify their own intrinsic sense of doubt that comes up. Conformity. Is the next thing. So apparently this is kind of a bit of a shock, not shock, but it can be confusing to some people, because narcissists can be blatantly, especially with like psychopaths and like sociopaths and stuff, narcissists generally as well though, dark triad traits can have this overt sense of, you can't tell me what to do, no one can tell me what to do, I'm antisocial, I can do whatever I want, like you can't, whatever. And I just want to say this is different to like having your own mind and going about life in the way you want, even if it does appear to be antisocial at that time. I'm talking about people that are like, what's the word? Oppositionally defiant. So they'll go overtly against any sort of, norm or sort of, easy way of going about life, or just like, healthy pattern, just to cause issues. That's what I mean by oppositionally defiant, not just sort of like going your own path and choosing your own choices, which we all have the will of choice, but it's people that openly go out of their way to deter from what everyone else wants to do just to cause an issue. So yeah, but conformity at the same time, they do recognise in the world, because of their like dysfunctional mind. Most people, like I would say I would be included in this, would kind of go through, I mean, it can roll in different ways. Obviously, the world is made up of many people, including narcissists and sociopaths and stuff. And psychopaths, sorry, I've said sociopaths, I was trying to figure out what order I said that in. But they see this conformity in the world, which they don't naturally do. They do because they want to be accepted, like any human being likes to be accepted into a tribe, but it's a case of like, they notice this conformity, and they're like, they have like this is why they can have black and white thinking as adults. Some narcissists are known to go through this like quite mundane sense of life that kind of just sort of like goes from going to work, coming home. You know, not to say if you do have that sort of 9 to 5 lifestyle that you're a narcissist or you're a mundane person or anything like that. I'm just saying, like, you know, sometimes narcissists can be mundane and have this black and white sense of self, like, I'm paying the bills, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, because it's how they conform and how they justify their own actions and whatever. It can be a sense of narcissism that comes into that. Not to say that just doing the typical things in the day is a narcissistic trait, but it can be from a level of narcissism that they feel like they're doing, that's how they justify certain things in themselves, even if they're like really not a good person or whatever. Yeah, but they sense, because of this conformist society, not conformist society so much as the conformity that's in the world, they think if I can get you to conform to me, as in their personal preferences and beliefs or whatever, they've won in some way, and they've kind of dominated that sense of the world that they really probably find quite confusing, because they don't like to cause good things, they just like to cause like chaos. So that conformity is quite like foreign to them, but they know that they need to do it in order to function in society and not obviously be excluded from a tribe. So that's just another thing they can get riled up about. But to have their own like mischievous humour, they like it when you conform to them, because it makes them feel like they've sort of transcended this situation, or sort of false sense of transcending this situation. Or they might do sort of you know, temporarily, but if you've got a brain in your head, you're not going to sort of conform to their like delusional rules or whatever. I know you can be coerced into this sort of stuff or whatever, especially in things like relationships. I think that's how toxic relationships come about, when you've got a toxic person that is trying to sort of like coerce you or trick you, shall I say, into conforming to their sort of sense of reality, that they kind of put forward as like this sort of like beautiful and love bombing or whatever, can kind of draw you into their sort of lifestyle or way that they want to you to perceive them. And this can come down to conformity as well. So that's helped me come to terms with past toxic relationships that I've had, actually. So that's good to know. But yeah, often we can take the bait of these things, in terms of, for example, if a narcissist is trying to make you angry, to get angry at that. And I did a recent video about toxic people in passing and the rude security guard. And you can take the bait, and push back to probably an extent that you don't need to, and defend yourself to the point of emotional collapse, because you're trying to plead your case and convince a narcissist that you should be treated with respect. Again, I think this is the thing about narcissists, is you have to set boundaries sometimes. It's setting boundaries all the time, whether you tell them about them or not, but it's a case of, in terms of communicating your boundaries, you can do that, but know that they won't be respected. And things like defending yourself is actually a way to just keep them, you know, beating you down. So you can defend yourself, but often they will use your self-defense as like they'll perceive it as like an attack. So they will then attack you further. It's kind of like, I always like to relate it to snakes, because because they're like snakes, but it's like a case of like, if you go up to like a snake and you're not trying to hurt it, you're trying to pet it, for example, and they perceive you as like an attacker, so they'll like bite you. It's kind of that sort of thing. Not that you should like fear, it's not that you should like pity them because of that. It's just a case of like, you know, if you defend yourself, you're challenging their false sense of self, and that therefore is an attack, because narcissists are very black and white thinking. They think either you're on my side or you're not on my side, and this it's slightly different to the whole Jekyll and Hyde thing that they have, where sometimes they're really kind and sometimes they're really nasty. That can form trauma bonding, and that's a whole other facet of narcissism. Let's not do all that now. But when you do plead your case and stuff like that, it shows that you have been ensnared by them, because you don't need to defend yourself in life. Do you know what I mean? You should be free to go about life in how you need to go about it. And it's not it's not a life lesson that everyone knows off the bat. It's something that you I think you do know it from off the bat, but sometimes toxic people can make you forget and challenge this sort of thing, especially if they create dependency in things like upbringing or relationships or whatever. Narcissists like you to be in dependency to them, so they can lure you in back into their cage and use you as another sort of projection object, because they do see you as a tool, not a person. So in their damage, as I said, is easier to bear if they think you're in a tighter cage. So yeah, if they feel a sense of inadequacy, shame, anger, whatever, they feel relieved of that to a small extent, or to whatever extent that they delude themselves into, thinking that you are in a tighter cage than them, of anger or shame or fear or domination or dependency or whatever, because they're dependent on their I'm not talking about dependency, but they like it when you're dependent on them, probably from a conformist level. But yeah, it's a sense of like moving forward from this to say, like, I am free, I can choose for myself. You can see their manipulations and like find out early warning signs and red flags earlier, which is what I've been able to do recently since learning about all this stuff. Saying being me is sufficient. I'm not open to manipulation and abuse. I'm not choosing the cage. I'm not saying it's even when you are completely educated about this stuff that you won't have to interact with them, because you will. As I said, even in passing, it's just about limiting contact with people like that as much as you can. I know things like work are really difficult to do that in, and obviously, but when it comes to like romantic relationships and stuff, it's really about challenging and questioning and making sure you're aware of the actual reality of the situation, and any sort of relationship, friendship, family relationship, whatever. It's so important to be honest with yourself about what you're giving to the situation, whether it's an equally yoked relationship, because it says in the Bible, don't be unequally yoked. It's just to say that. Obviously, I'm not telling you what to do, but I think it can be very helpful in identifying toxic relationships, and where you're just better equipped to reserve your energy for people that are going to reciprocate it properly. So yeah, and bearing in mind dependency, as I said, that some people do like you to be narcissists like you to be dependent on them, and this is why they will love bomb you, get you to trust them, and then they will slowly degrade you and get you in this sort of like trauma bonded cycle in order to make you come back to them and seek validation out, because they're very as I said, insecure and validation seeking. So as a projection, they like you to go back to them to gain that validation that they are sort of unable to give themselves, because they won't validate themselves because they're not doing things worthy of validation, and they can't look within themselves to find validation anyway. So they rely, because of their ego and stuff, it's very external, their locus of control. No, sorry, not their locus of control. Their validation that they seek is very external. So bearing in mind, I've just thought about something that could relate to conformity, which I've just realised is toxic bosses. This makes so much sense with toxic bosses for me. This idea of when they want you to conform to them, to like a stupid extent, like that literally like knocks the toxic boss on the head. Like, she literally was that in a nutshell. She just wanted you to conform to her silly ways, like and then she'd project it back on you, like you were doing shit that was weird and stuff that was like unnecessary. She literally just wanted you to be like conforming to her. Oh my god, that makes so much sense. I love it when these things get ticked off in your head. That's why I like doing these videos as well, because it just makes sense to me. So yeah, she wanted to put me in a tighter cage of conformity than she was in the fact, she was disliked in the workplace and just, that sort of thing. So also another toxic relationship I've had, when I was sociopathically verbally abused in a past situation. They clearly felt very attacked in their lives, and then projected that on me and literally brutally attacked me for absolutely no reason verbally. for no apparent reason. There we go. So they wanted to keep me in a tighter cage of, you know, being dominated than they felt at that time. So that makes a lot of sense. So anyway, the goal is growth, insight, self-respect, peace, and awareness, and to not be anyone's prisoner and get to your own truth. Because if, you know, as an autonomous person, you're not going to want to be a prisoner. You're not going to choose to be a prisoner of any sound mind. Or, you know, I'm not saying sound mind because sometimes you're conditioned as a child to be in these sort of toxic relationships. I wouldn't say sound mind because it doesn't mean you don't have a sound mind just because you've been abused in childhood necessarily. And there's lots of variation between that. I'm not so yeah, my camera's right to stop and stop digging myself a hole, but it's a case of, yeah, you just being autonomous and truthful to yourself, having self-respect, and being like, you know, I'm free as a person within my own right, and it's not for you to come out and entrap me in your dysfunctional planet. So there we go. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.